What if I told you there was an object so holy that a single touch could end your life in an instant? No warning, no second chance, no time to say goodbye. And what if that object once stood at the very center of a nation's faith, then vanished without a trace? Tonight, we step into one of the most mysterious and unsettling stories in the Bible, the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest that no one dare to touch and that the world has never found again. The holiest and most dangerous object. Imagine standing in the desert heat of ancient Israel. The wind moves across a vast encampment of tents. In the very center stands a sacred structure, the tabernacle, and inside its innermost chamber, hidden behind a thick veil, rests a golden chest unlike anything else in human history. This was no mere religious symbol. This was the Ark of the Covenant, covered in pure gold, crowned with two cherubim facing one another. And between those cherubim, according to Scripture, the manifested presence of God. But here is what makes the Ark unlike any other sacred object in history. Touch it and you die. Look at it uncovered and you die. Approach it without authorization and you die. That sounds extreme, even terrifying. And yet, the biblical record treats it not as exaggeration, not as mythology, but as documented reality. A man named Uzzah reached out instinctively to steady the ark and fell dead beside it. 70 men in a town called Beth Shemesh looked inside, and 70 funerals followed the same day. No exceptions, no appeals, no negotiations. And then, 2,600 years ago, the ark disappeared. Not stolen in a dramatic raid, not displayed in a museum, not recovered by archaeologists. It simply vanished from history. So before we ask where it is, we must ask something deeper. Why was it so deadly? Was it superstition? Was it ancient fear? Or was something far more profound happening? Something about holiness that we have forgotten in the modern world? To understand this, we must step back into the wilderness, into the laws given through Moses, and into the mindset of a people who lived in daily awareness that God's presence was not merely symbolic. It was real, and sometimes dangerously real. Body-eye, the rules were clear. The first thing we discover when reading the biblical instructions is this. The danger surrounding the ark was not vague. It was precise. The book of Numbers lays out detailed procedures for transporting the ark inside. Only a specific family within the tribe of Levi, the Kohathites, were allowed to carry it. Even they could not touch it directly. First, the high priest had to cover the ark with a veil, then with protective skins, then with a blue cloth. 3 layers. Only after it was completely concealed could the carriers enter the room and lift it, using poles that were permanently inserted into golden rings on its sides. The poles were not decorative. They were protection. The message was unmistakable. Human hands were not to come into direct contact with what represented God's throne. The Hebrew word used in these warnings for die carries the weight of judicial execution. It is the same term used for capital punishment. This was not metaphorical language. The Israelites understood something we struggle to grasp today. Holiness is not just moral goodness. It is otherness. It is absolute purity existing in a category entirely beyond human corruption. If you bring paper too close to the flame is not damaged. The paper is consumed. The biblical narrative presents God's holiness in similar terms: radiant, intense, powerful. And the ark was the focal point of that intensity. 2. The day celebration turned into a funeral. Fast forward centuries. King David decides it is time to bring the ark to Jerusalem. The nation rejoices. Musicians play harps and tambourines. The king himself dances before the Lord. It is a moment of national pride and spiritual excitement. But in the midst of celebration, something goes terribly wrong. The ark is placed on a cart pulled by oxen, a method borrowed from neighboring nations. When the animals stumble, a man named Uzzah reaches out to steady the ark. It is an instinctive reaction. It appears noble. It feels heroic. And he dies. The music stops. The dancing ends. Silence falls. The text says that David was both angry and afraid. The procession halts. The ark is diverted to a nearby house for 3 months. Why such severity? Because good intentions cannot replace obedience. The instructions had been given generations earlier. The ark was to be carried on shoulders with poles, not transported on a cart. In that moment, familiarity replaced reverence. Uzzah had grown up near the Arkansas. What was once awe-inspiring had become ordinary. But holiness does not become less holy simply because we become comfortable, and the entire nation witnessed the consequence. 3. The massacre at Beth Shemesh. Another incident removes any doubt that Uzzah's death was an isolated accident. After a period of war, the Philistines capture the Arkansas. Soon plagues break out in their cities. Tumors, panic, devastation. Terrified, they return to Israel. When the ark arrives in Beth Shemesh, the people rejoice, but some grow curious. They look inside. 70 men die that day. 70. The celebration transforms into mourning, and the people cry out, "Who can stand before this holy God?" That question echoes across centuries. Who can stand? For what was inside the ark? To understand why the ark carried such weight, we must consider its contents. Inside were 3 items: the stone tablets of the law, the 10 Commandments, described as written by the finger of God, Aaron's rod that budded, a sign of divinely chosen priesthood, a jar of manna, bread from heaven that sustained Israel in the wilderness. The ark was not just a container. It was a physical archive of a covenant. It represented divine authority, divine provision, and divine law. And above it, between the cherubim, God promised to meet with his people. The ark symbolized concentrated access to divine presence. That is why only the high priest could enter the most holy place, and only once a year after elaborate purification rituals. Even then, incense smoke filled the room, forming a protective barrier between human eyes and divine glory. Holiness was not theatrical. It was treated as reality. The disappearance. Then history turns a corner. In 586 BC, Babylon conquers Jerusalem. The temple is destroyed. Sacred objects are listed among the spoils of war, but the ark is not mentioned. When the Jews return from exile and build the second temple, the inner sanctuary is empty. No Arkansas, no cherubim, no visible glory. It is simply gone. For 2,600 years, no confirmed discovery has surfaced. Some traditions say it was hidden in a cave. Others claim it rests in Ethiopia. Some believe it lies beneath the Temple Mount. But there is no verified evidence. The holiest and most feared object in Israel's history disappeared and has never been found. 6. Was that an accident? The prophet Jeremiah hinted that a time would come when people would no longer speak of the ark, nor would they miss it. Why? Because its purpose was temporary. The New Testament presents the ark and the entire sacrificial system as shadows, pointing forward to something greater. The law written on stone would be fulfilled in a living word. The priestly rod would point toward a greater high priest. The manna would foreshadow a different bread from heaven. And when Jesus died, the veil of the temple tore from top to bottom. Access changed under the old covenant. Unauthorized contact with holiness meant death. Under the new covenant, through Christ, holiness transforms rather than destroys. The ark represented separation. The torn veil represents invitation. Conclusion. So why was touching the ark fatal? Because it symbolized the most intense meeting point between absolute holiness and imperfect humanity. It was not superstition. It was not divine temper. It was a collision between 2 incompatible conditions, purity and corruption. But the story does not end in fear. The ark's disappearance is not merely a historical mystery. It is a theological statement. The symbol stepped aside when fulfillment arrived. And perhaps that is why its location remains hidden. Not because God lost it, but because humanity no longer needs a golden throne hidden behind a veil. The deeper question is no longer, where is the ark? The deeper question is, how do we approach holiness today? And that question leads us not to a buried artifact, but to an open invitation, the weight of holiness. So we left off with a question hanging in the air. Why would touching a sacred object result in instant death? If we are honest, it unsettles us. It feels severe, almost excessive. But to understand what happened, we have to step into a world very different from ours, a world where the presence of God was not abstract theology, but visible tangible reality. Let's walk into that world together. The law was not symbolic. It was specific. When the ark was first instructed in the wilderness under Moses, it was built according to precise instructions, not artistic suggestions, not spiritual metaphors. Detailed specifications. Only one tribe, Levi, was assigned to serve around the tabernacle. And even within that tribe, only one family, the sons of Kohath, were permitted to carry the ark. But here's the part that matters most. Even they were forbidden to touch it. Before the ark could be moved, Aaron and his sons, the priests, had to enter first. They covered with the inner veil, the same veil that separated the most holy place from the rest of the tabernacle. Then they added protective coverings. Then a blue cloth, 3 layers. Only after it was completely concealed could the Kohathites step forward and lift it using poles that were permanently inserted into its rings. Those poles were never removed. Imagine that. An object designed in such a way that no human hand would ever need to come into contact with it. This was not superstition. It was intentional distance. Because the ark was not just furniture. It was described as the place where God would meet with Moses from between the cherubim. It was, in effect, a throne. And in the ancient world, approaching a throne uninvited could cost you your life. How much more when that throne symbolized the creator of heaven and earth? 2. Uzzah, a moment that shook a nation. Now fast forward centuries. The ark had been sitting for years in the house of Abinadab. Israel had gone through seasons of war, chaos, and spiritual drift. Then a new king rose, David. David wanted to restore spiritual focus. He wanted the ark brought to Jerusalem, the new capital. This was meant to be a turning point, a renewal of national identity. So they organized a grand celebration. Musicians played. People sang. David danced with abandon. The ark was placed on a new cart pulled by oxen, a decision that seemed practical. After all, when the Philistines returned the ark years earlier, they had used a cart. It worked for them. But what works under extraordinary circumstances is not necessarily the standard God established. As the procession moved forward, the oxen stumbled. The ark shifted. Uzzah reached out. We can almost feel the reflex. A split-second decision. He didn't want it to fall. He didn't want the sacred object to hit the ground. His intention appears honorable, but intention does not erase instruction. The moment his hand touched the ark, he collapsed. The music stopped. Silence spread across the crowd like a shockwave. Scripture records that David was angry and afraid. He halted the entire procession. The ark was taken aside to the house of Obed-Edom for 3 months. Imagine being there that day. Thousands celebrating. Then one man lifeless beside the ark. That moment forced the nation to confront something uncomfortable. God's holiness was not negotiable. David later realized their mistake. When he attempted again to bring the ark to Jerusalem, this time it was carried properly, on shoulders with poles, according to the law. This time there was no tragedy, because reverence replaced assumption. 3. Beth Shemesh, when curiosity turned deadly. But Uzzah's death was not the only incident. Years before David's reign, Israel had suffered defeat in battle. In desperation, they carried the ark into war, treating it almost like a lucky charm. It did not save them. The Philistines captured it and placed it in the temple of their god Dagon. The next morning, Dagon's statue had fallen face down before the Arkansas. The following day, it lay shattered. Then disease spread, painful tumors, panic, chaos. City after city experienced devastation. Terrified, the Philistines decided to return the Arkansas. They placed it on a cart drawn by 2 nursing cows and sent it toward Israel. The cows went straight to the town of Beth Shemesh. When the Israelites saw the ark approaching, they rejoiced. It felt like victory, restoration. But then, curiosity crept in. Some men looked inside. The text says 70 men died that day. 70. No lightning bolts described. No dramatic scene. Simply the statement. They were struck down. The people cried out, "Who can stand before the Lord, this holy God?" That question is the emotional center of the story. Who can stand? Because this was not random punishment. It was consistent with the pattern established in the wilderness. Unauthorized contact with concentrated holiness resulted in death. 4. The presence between the cherubim. What made the ark so different from every other sacred object? Above its lid, called a mercy seat, stood two golden cherubim facing one another. Between them, Scripture described the glory of God manifesting. This was not claiming God was confined to a box. Rather, it was a designated place of manifestation, the point where heaven and earth intersected in a visible way. When Moses entered the tabernacle, a pillar of cloud would descend. When Israel camped in the wilderness, the cloud guided them by day, fire by night. Holiness in the biblical worldview was not poetic imagery. It was experienced as overwhelming light, fire, and power. Mount Sinai trembled when God descended upon it. Boundaries were set around the mountain. Anyone who crossed them would die. The ark carried that same reality, but concentrated. Think of sunlight compared to a focused laser beam. The same source, different intensity. The most holy place was like standing inside the beam. Only the high priest could enter. Only once a year. Only after sacrifices, washings, and ritual preparation. Incense smoke filled the chamber, so that the priest would not gaze directly upon the glory. There are even traditions suggesting a rope was tied to the priest's ankle in case he died inside, so he could be pulled out without another entering. Whether that detail is historical or not, it captures how serious the moment was. Entering the presence of God was not casual. It was life or death. What the ark contained. Inside the ark were 3 items, each loaded with meaning. The stone tablets of the law, described as written by the finger of God. These were not merely commandments. They were covenant terms. Aaron's rod that budded, once a dead staff, miraculously brought to life overnight as a sign of divine authority. And a jar of manna, the bread that sustained Israel for 40 years in the wilderness. Law, authority, provision. The ark held the testimony that God was not myth, but active presence. To touch the ark irreverently was to treat lightly the covenant itself. It symbolized putting human hands on divine revelation. 6. The disappearance. Then history reached a breaking point. In 586 BC, Babylon invaded Jerusalem. The temple was burned. Sacred vessels were carried away. But when the inventory of captured items is recorded, the ark is missing, not listed among the spoils, not described as destroyed, just absent. When the second temple was built decades later, the most holy place stood empty. No Arkansas, no cherubim, no visible glory. Jewish tradition later noted 5 things missing from the second temple, the ark being the foremost. Where did it go? Some believe it was hidden before the invasion. Others think it was destroyed quietly. Legends place it in caves, tunnels, even Ethiopia. But there is no verified discovery. And perhaps that absence is not accidental. 7. Shadow and fulfillment. Centuries later, writers of the New Testament reflected on the tabernacle system and describe it as a shadow, a copy of heavenly realities. The ark, the sacrifices, the priesthood, all pointing forward. When Jesus was crucified, the veil of the temple tore from top to bottom. The barrier separating the most holy place was removed. Under the old covenant, holiness and sin collided with lethal results. Under the new covenant, something changed. Instead of destruction, there is transformation. Instead of distance, access. Instead of a golden box hidden behind a curtain, the presence of God is described as dwelling among people, even within them. This does not mean holiness became weaker. It means the means of approach was altered. The ark once symbolized separation, a boundary that could not be crossed casually. Its disappearance coincides with a shift in how access to God would be understood, which brings us to the edge of a profound realization. The ark's deadly reputation was not about cruelty. It was about clarity. It revealed that holiness is real. It exposed that human imperfection cannot casually stand in its presence. And it prepared a way for something greater, a solution that would allow flawed humanity to approach without being consumed. And that is where our story turns next. The kind of king we truly need. And so the crown passed, not in a moment of applause, not in a ceremony filled with celebration, but in silence, after the storm, after the battlefield, after a king who once stood taller than any man in Israel fell beneath the weight of his own fear. When we last left the story, Saul stood under dark skies, armored, restless, unraveling, and David, once the shepherd boy with a sling, stood quietly in the wings of history, waiting for a throne he never tried to steal. But here is where the story deepens, because this was never just about two men. It was never simply about a throne in ancient Israel. It was about the human heart. It was about us. The end of Saul, when fear replaces faith. Saul's final days were marked not by courage, but by desperation. The Philistines advanced once again. The same enemy David once faced with nothing but a sling. Only this time, Saul did not hear the voice of God. The prophet Samuel had already died, and Saul, who once sought the Lord, now found only silence. That silence terrified him, because when you spent years ignoring God's voice, the absence of it becomes unbearable. Scripture tells us Saul sought guidance, not from God, but from a medium, a forbidden path, a final attempt to control what he could no longer trust. It was a tragic end of a man who began with promise, but slowly replaced obedience with image, faith with insecurity, humility with control. And in one final battle on Mount Gilboa, Saul fell on his own sword. The first king of Israel died not in victory, but in collapse. It is a sobering image, a reminder that leadership without surrender eventually destroys itself. But while one king's story closed, another was just beginning. David's grief, the heart of a different king. Here is something extraordinary. When David heard of Saul's death, he did not celebrate. He did not say, finally. He wept. He mourned the very man who hunted him. David wrote a lament for Saul and Jonathan, a song of grief, not revenge. That is when we begin to understand the difference. Saul clung to power. David trusted God's timing. Saul feared losing his throne. David feared losing God's presence. And that distinction changes everything, because the greatest leaders are not defined by their victories, but by their hearts. The crown in Hebron. David was first crowned king not over all Israel, but over the tribe of Judah and Hebron. Years passed before the entire nation recognized him. Years of patience. Years of political tension. Years of waiting. It is easy to forget this part. We love the dramatic moment when David defeats Goliath, but we often overlook the long, quiet stretch between promise and fulfillment. And maybe that is where many of us live, in the waiting, in the almost, in the space between what God has spoken and what we currently see. David's life reminds us that delay does not mean denial. Sometimes it means preparation. Jerusalem, a new center. Eventually, David united the tribes and established Jerusalem as the capital. Jerusalem was not just strategic. It was symbolic. It represented unity, a fresh start, a new identity for a divided people. David brought the Ark of the Covenant into the city with celebration and dancing, an act that showed something radical for a king. He was not ashamed of worship. He did not hide his dependence on God. He danced before the Lord with all his might. Imagine that image. A king secure enough to kneel, strong enough to worship, powerful enough to surrender. This is what Israel truly needed all along. Not height, not charisma, not outward strength, but a heart aligned with heaven, the promise beyond David. Yet even David was not perfect. His story would later include failure, sin, and painful consequences. But here is what sets him apart. When confronted, he repented. When broken, he returned. When exposed, he humbled himself. That posture matters. And through David, God made a promise, a covenant that his throne would be established forever, a kingdom that would not end. For generations, Israel would look back at David as the model of kingship and forward toward something greater, because David, as remarkable as he was, pointed beyond himself to another shepherd, another unlikely king, born not in a palace, but in Bethlehem, David's own town. Centuries later, under Roman occupation, in a quiet manger, that promise began to unfold, and the prophets declared that this coming king would sit on David's throne. That king would not fall like Saul. He would not waver like David. He would not cling to power. He would lay down his life. That king was Jesus Christ. And suddenly the story of Israel's first kings becomes more than ancient history. It becomes preparation. What this means for us. If we strip away the armor and the crowns, the battles and the political drama, what remains? A question. What kind of king do we want? Saul represents the leadership we choose when we prioritize appearance. David represents the leadership God builds when he shapes the heart. And Jesus represents a leadership that saves. We still live in a world that often chooses height over humility, confidence over character, control over surrender. But the story whispers something different. It tells us that the true strength of a leader is not found in the battlefield, but in obedience. It tells us that God sees what we overlook, that he calls shepherds when nations expect warriors, that he works in caves when palaces crumble. And maybe, just maybe, this story is not only about kings of Israel. Maybe it is about the throne inside each of us. Who sits there? Fear? Pride? Control? Or trust? The quiet question that remains. As the credits of this chapter of history roll, we are left with an image. Saul, tall, armored, fallen. David, worshiping, waiting, rising. And far beyond them, a cross outside Jerusalem, a crown of thorns, a kingdom not of this world. History often remembers the loudest figures, but heaven remembers the surrender ones. So the next time you hear the story of Israel asking for a king, don't just see ancient politics. See the mirror, because the real story is not about a throne in Jerusalem. It is about the condition of the heart. And that story is still being written.